Welcome to a special edition of Market Pulse. I'm your host, Kerry Briscoe, Client Relationship Manager on the Listed Execution Desk. Day to day, we provide our clients with market colour that helps shape the view of the industry. As a Client Relationship Manager, it's important to note that the views shared on this podcast, whether from me, my guests, or anyone associated with the Marex Market Pulse podcast, are independent and do not reflect the official stance of my employer, firm, or associated institutions. Today, I'm joined by James Nation, Managing Director of UK Politics at Forefront Advisors, to discuss the potential market impact of the upcoming elections. James previously served as Deputy Head of the Number 10 Policy Unit, before that as a Special Advisor to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He has also been a civil servant in both the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government and the Treasury. And he's also worked on tax and fiscal policy at the CBI. So, James, welcome to Market Pulse.
Delighted to be with you today, Kerry. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Thank you. So, James, I think it's fair to say it's been an eventful start to the year.
Yep.
We started with Labour having experienced the greatest loss of support of any newly elected government. There was rumours of a leadership challenge as early as January.
Mm-hmm.
Then the focus moved, obviously, to the US and Iran conflict, where we saw huge moves in the gilt market, particularly at the front end. We went from UK pricing 2 cuts to almost then up to 4 hikes. However, since then, as we've entered a bit of fatigue with the headlines, we've then moved back to have focus on Keir Starmer, and particularly his appointment of Peter Mandelson. With that backdrop, we are entering into the 7th of May elections.
Mm-hmm.
We've got local elections in England and we have national elections in Scotland and Wales. We've seen Reform storming heading the polls. We've seen a surge from the Greens. Is this potentially the end of the two-party system? And are we expect to see more political fragmentation?
Well, the big question, certainly, I think UK politics is more fragmented than we've seen it for quite some time. That's probably the understatement of the chat already. Look, the story last year, and you put it well, was the rise of reform. But what we've seen since, and I think this was particularly clear with the Gorton and Denton by-election in February, is a fracturing on the left of British politics as well, and the surge of the Greens. And what I think these elections just 2 weeks away are going to confirm is major damage for the two main political parties. I think, the Tories are going to have hard races facing off against reform in areas like Essex. They might hold on to some of their heartlands in London, but otherwise you're going to see further evidence of the Conservatives losing support to reform in the Lib Dems. And for Labour, as you say, the big issue for the Labour Party has been, at the moment, they're only holding on to half roughly of their 2024 voters. And those voters, some are going to reform. You'll see evidence of that in England, but others are going to other parties on the left. And crucially, and this is where I think Wales is quite interesting, Kerry, there is an anti-reform tactical vote out there. But I think the beneficiary of that in Wales is not going to be the Labour Party. It's going to be Plaid Cymru, the separatist party. So if we take a big step back, what I'd say to people before we get to Keir Starmer maybe and the current situation is we are now in an era of bloc politics. We're in an era of who can unite and consolidate the vote on the left of British politics and on the right of British politics. That's the debate and the challenge right now. You've obviously got the split between Reform and the Tories on the right, but on the left, it's who can consolidate that Labour vote, bring it home and unite maybe some of the anti-Farage tactical piece. And that is where the doubts in Keir Starmer's leadership creep in before you get to all of the political risks that we've seen just over this last week or so crystallise.
So how bad could these elections be for Labour? And how is that potentially going to be the final hurdle where Keir Starmer finally falls and then we start to see leadership challenges? And if so, how will that actually play out? What is the thing that our clients should be looking for as the trigger? I think we all became very aware during the Conservative challenges, the format, the letters into the 1922. It's very different for Labour. So how would that turn out?
So there's a lot there, but just to break it down, if we were having this conversation a few weeks ago, I'd have said the following to you. I'd have said that I still think the May elections and the results have the potential to be a moment of real shock for the Labour Party. but that momentum was maybe growing behind the view that Keir Starmer might have a bit more time, primarily for two reasons. One, the Iran fallout and that crisis, and the fact that there are very real cost of living pressures and the geopolitical situation is so uncertain. And the second reason is just some of the incentives around who might want to take up the Labour leadership and be the next Prime Minister. Particularly if we think about a figure like Andy Burnham, who's not in the House of Commons. What's changed in these last few weeks? And we don't need to get into the ins and outs, I think, of the Mandelson appointment and who knew what the PM said. The point is more that it just leaves an impression of chaos at the heart of government, in the views, I think, of some Labour figures. And so what it risks doing is it risks bringing the focus of the Cabinet Labour MPs back to some quite fundamental questions about Keir Starmer's leadership, which then brings us to what do we think happens with these elections in a few weeks' time? And you ask, how bad could this be for the Labour Party? Well, obviously, polling is inherently uncertain in this fractured world. But based on what we know, you've got a race in areas like London with all the boroughs up, where there's a very real prospect of the Greens taking councils like Hackney, taking a large number of seats off the Labour Party. Elsewhere in the country, if we think about areas like Sunderland, Tyneside, Walsall, ex-industrial sort of Labour heartlands, there's a real threat there vis-a-vis reform. So you've got the prospect of results in England which show that squeeze on both sides, be that to reform, but also the fracturing of the vote on the left with the rise of the Greens and others. Then in Scotland, I think the big question mark there is how large the SNP's lead is and whether they have enough to have a majority when it comes to government. And obviously that potentially brings questions back about an independence referendum. But that is one where, again, if we were talking 18 months ago, Labour should have been projected to do quite well. They did well in the 2024 general election. But here, again, we're looking at SNP lead, and we're looking at whether reform performs strong enough to knock Labour into third in terms of votes, not necessarily seats. And then lastly, Wales. Wales is one where since devolution, it's been a real Labour heartland. And as I kind of hinted at earlier, what you're looking for there is not just the rise of reform, but also what happens with Plaid Cymru.
Yep.
And if they are able to form a government, minority or otherwise, or even if they're the largest party, again, it tells us that the tactical vote to keep reform out is not going to Labour. Now, a final thing before I get to your point on triggers. Look, in a sense, this is what always happens. Local elections, national elections in the devolves are always where a governing party gets a kicking.
Yeah.
But I think here, given we've now got this much more fragmented political environment, we've got the insurgent parties on the left and the right, it does just lead potentially to a bit more of a panicked reaction potentially because of what you've seen happen by way of the declining vote share for Labour over the last, since they came to power, really. Now, on triggers, so let's just assume, bad set of local election results.
Yep.
Currently within Westminster, maybe a view that the ongoing Mandelson developments are enough for people to conclude maybe it's time to consider a future beyond Keir Starmer. It's all inherently uncertain, but you've got to watch the days and weeks after the May elections. People always talk about formal processes for removing prime ministers, whether that's no confidence votes on the Conservative side or whether that's thresholds for MPs to support a challenger on the Labour side. But in my experience and based on British political history, prime ministers tend to go when the cabinet loses confidence in them. So something to watch in those days and weeks following on from local elections will be, do the cabinet say to Keir Starmer, unfortunately, your time is up. We need you to set out a timetable for your departure so that we can initiate a leadership contest. Lastly, on timelines, very hard for me to predict the exact day that all of this comes to a head. But what I can say to people listening is I think the Labour Party, if it decides to move on from Keir Starmer, needs this sorted in time for Labour Party conference in late September. And the key complication there is obviously Andy Burnham, because Andy Burnham is not yet, he's not a serving Labour MP, which he would need to be in order to initiate a challenge. And so I think a big question for MPs on what we call the soft left of the Labour Party is, are they waiting for Andy? Or do they decide, no, we need to get things in motion now in order to line up a change in leadership in time for conference?
Thank you. So obviously, Labour, bad situation for Labour, potentially third in Scotland, lose Wales, bad local elections could potentially bring that trigger. And we were looking out for cabinet ministers. Obviously, some of the cabinet ministers already recently have been slightly less supportive on the wires
Indeed.
over the last week. So, um, but obviously, if they don't decide to go for the leadership challenge, for our clients, I feel that markets will continue to be driven by, the bigger picture of the US and
Yep.
Iran war. Obviously, as I mentioned, gilt yields are also already substantially higher. But I think for clients, the risk will be that we do get that sort of political instability. Because if they
Yes.
do go for the challenge, we do have then a period of, a weeks that you say, where we have the leadership challenge and we will not know what the future of the Labour Party will look like. So could you maybe explain, as the most important person as well, although they're going to be changing the PM, will be the Chancellor.
Yes.
So maybe you can explain some of the potential leaders and also who they would be picking as their Chancellor and whether they would be maintain or stay on the path of fiscal prudence. I feel the market seems to be quite comfortable with Rachel Reeves right now, that she will maintain sort of those fiscal rules. But what about the future potential Chancellor?
So I think the first thing to say is, in any scenario, even in a scenario where Starmer survives for a bit, the
Mm,
Labour Party is moving further to the left.
right.
You will see that in, I think, the programme of legislation that comes out in the King's speech following on from local elections. You can definitely see that in some of the noises that you are hearing. If you think about immigration
Mm,
reform, for instance, you're definitely seeing the soft left core of the Labour Party, who are the majority of Labour MPs, push back against perhaps some of the more bits of a Labour agenda that have tried to counter
mm,
reform's emphasis on certain policy
mm,
areas. So that is happening anyway. But as you say, I think the key question is, before we get to runners and riders for Chancellor, what this means in terms of fiscal. I can definitely foresee, movements in yields, movements in prices
mm,
in the event that Starmer goes, or for fear that he would go, and an assumption that, well, that is going to bring a more agenda to the left or move the agenda to the left. But I think the one thing that I would say is Andy Burnham's comments last year before Labour Party conference that
mm.
clients will recall, we shouldn't be in
Yes.
hock to the bond markets. I think that has genuinely been a teachable moment for senior figures in the Labour Party.
Right.
And so my own view is I don't think you're going to see an immediate fiscal loosening if a new leader comes in. They know there is not the space to do that. I actually think you're probably, if you're a new prime minister and a chancellor, certainly in the near term, going to need to stick to Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules or operate under them when you come to do a budget in the autumn, because I think the market constraints are just the market constraints. Now,
Indeed.
there are challenges that any new team will have to sort out. For the one point, Rachel Reeves's plans for future public spending when it comes to public services or departments
Mm,
are politically unrealistic. So you're going to have to top those up. We haven't got an answer on the defence question yet.
mm,
And we might have a forecast from the OBR in the autumn that shows, to one of your earlier points, the real damage and impact on headroom as a result of the Iran crisis.
yeah.
So those are all headaches that you are going to have to deal with. And of course, there'll be a return to revenue raisers, to, I think, looking at property taxes again, quote unquote wealth taxes, much in the tax and fiscal agenda that is much more in line with quote unquote Labour values compared to Starmer and Reeves. I do just want to make this point, though, that I think any candidate will realise, if they don't know already, that they have to box clever when it comes to fiscal and will not be able to just decide we're going to
Mm,
do a discretionary loosening, because I just think that the market constraints now are clear.
yeah.
On who's runners and runner or riders for Chancellor, I think the name to look out for here is probably Ed Miliband. Ed Miliband, I don't think he wants the top job.
No.
But I think he does ideally want number 11. So I think he's someone to watch, who Yeah, has his own strong views, I think, when it comes to energy policy. You've seen that, I think, would definitely be much more critical, perhaps, of some OBR assumptions around some of the returns from government investment or government spending on public services. But this is a guy who also did work for Gordon Brown, who
Yeah.
does have some Treasury experience. So watch out for Miliband. Then, more generally, just to bring this back, just watch out for a bit of balance at the top of the ticket. What do I mean by that? I mean, for example, if Angela Rayner wins,
Mm.
maybe you offer Chancellor to Wes Streeting. You kind of signal to the markets, I'm going to make my big rival, but also who's someone who's perhaps known for being more in line with the centre of the Labour Party. I'll make him Chancellor. And maybe that's reassuring.
Mm.
But conversely, let's say Wes Streeting wins. Maybe he feels, well, I've got to have Ed Miliband in because he's popular with the soft left. So I just, without getting too much into different combinations, just watch for that balance at the top of the ticket, I think, at the end of what will be quite a painful leadership contest if we get there, I think.
Yeah. So I think the key for that is markets should be contained, because no matter who is in charge, whoever the leader is or the chancellor, you're fairly confident they're going to be sticking to the fiscal rules for now. So up until the autumn budget, things should remain sort of fairly stable. Obviously, we might have that few weeks of turmoil where we
Yes.
sort of get to know that, but generally going forward, they will be sticking with the fiscal rules.
Yeah, exactly. Look, I think instinctively, don't get me wrong, I think instinctively there is a lot of criticism on the Labour side
Mm.
towards Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules. You can see it in some comments that have been made earlier this week from prominent Labour MPs, this obsession with headroom, this need for greater long-termism. So, look, there is definitely an impulse to want to spend and invest more when it
Mm.
comes to capital projects and public services. But yes, I think there is also a realization that, from their perspective, the market constraints are the market constraints. And you are going to need to return to difficult questions on supply side reform and also possibly reform of welfare spending as well.
Yeah.
And I'll just say this, Kerry, here, which is like, you soon get to a point where when a sitting prime minister loses their authority, their ability to govern or get some difficult trade offs or reforms through their party diminishes. And so there's a chance, just a chance, that a new Labour leader might be in a better position to have some of those difficult conversations
Yeah.
with the Labour Party on reform. But yeah, I think there is still going to be this tussle between the market constraints and a Labour Party that will,
Mm.
at some stage, have to try and find some more room politically, certainly when it comes to spending on public services, for instance.
Do you think that there's any chance that they do go for any reform of the OBR or the Bank of England? There's been some comments, from Angela Rayner in the past potentially about changes to the OBR. Is that something that might be on the horizon if they're going to remain sort of fiscally credible still?
So I don't think the Bank of England, but I do think one of the curious things about UK politics at the moment, and there are a lot of curious things, which is why the job's fun, I guess,
Yeah.
is that you could listen to someone like Robert Jenrick on the reform side speak and about the OBR and Angela Rayner,
Mm.
and actually they're saying very similar things.
True.
Albeit the difference is, I think if you're Robert Jenrick, you don't think the OBR give enough credit for the dynamic effects of tax cuts. If you're Angela Rayner, you think they don't give enough credit for the dynamic effects from more public spending. But, they're basically saying a similar critique, which is the OBR is too conservative in its forecasting and needs to take on board, more varied feedback from different economists. So I think there will be some elements of OBR reform. And I think the OBR, for what it's worth, will be, I think, a bit of a punching bag over any leadership contest, because that is how, if you're a Labour leadership candidate, you critique Rachel Reeves, I think, without getting into, I'm just going to come in and tear up the fiscal rules, which
Mm.
they won't say because they'll fear the market reaction. But I think, look, again, there's an element here of you can critique the OBR all you like, but fundamentally, this does just come down to difficult choices and trade-offs that have to be made by politicians and have to be made in the context of, what will be a difficult financial outlook. And I think for anyone who comes in, you really have to try and
Mm.
judge what that autumn forecast looks
Mm.
like. Are the bank looking through Iran still as a one-off shock? Does that actually mean the path for bank rate and
Mm.
gilts looks all right? Does that give you some more fiscal space in the future? Bit more flexibility in the fiscal rules, if so, because they also roll forward. Are there options where you can just box and cocks, be a bit more pragmatic? Let's see. So I certainly agree with you. The OBR will be a focus, but I think a lot of it will come down to that first engagement with them on that key forecast in the autumn.
So, no matter who is in charge at the time, as we all are very aware, the fiscal headroom is going to be extremely tight.
Yeah.
So, for clients, maybe some political instability, into May. But if they don't go in May, that's going to be the end of the chance for leadership until 2027. Do you think?
It's more, I would have the backstop date in mind. I would have in mind you need to have a leadership contest, done, dusted, new prime minister in time for Labour Party conference. I think it's the 27th to the 30th of September.
September,
So the
yeah.
thing I just want to leave people with, Kerry, is if Starmer makes it to June,
Mm,
that doesn't necessarily mean he's then safe for the summer. It's just
okay.
the Labour Party need to decide, have we got enough time to say to the existing prime minister and leader he's got to go and hold a
Mm,
contest. If Starmer's still in post and you haven't had a contest come September, then I think you get to, more excuses not to change things up this year.
mm.
The budget, a difficult cost of living intervention potentially in September, which the Chancellor would have to do. Because remember, if you decide to intervene on the cost of living, you need to introduce any support in time for the energy bill price cap coming in from October. So I'm not saying the budget will be in September, but I am saying a chancellor, whoever is chancellor, will need to make some quite difficult announcements then on support for households, possibly,
Mm.
depending where we are. So the excuses start to mount up not to move. But again, I sort of go back to what I said earlier, because of what's happened in recent weeks and just a sort of sensing the mood music in Westminster, I lean towards the Labour Party potentially finding a way to make a change in time for that September conference. But let's see.
You're leaning
Yep.
towards a potential change.
Yeah.
So we do have obviously a couple of months ahead, which have a little bit of volatility. Obviously, markets are still very much dominated by the US-Iranian war. We have seen clients trying to sort of fade the pricing. Bank of England is still pricing sort of two hikes for this year at the moment. Obviously, we came into the year having sort of two cuts. One final question to sort of touch on actually will be that Labour does seem to have taken a more pro-EU adoption pro-EU adopted position than any UK government since Brexit. Will that have any effect, or is it still the fact that Reform are still very much ahead in the polls? Whatever Labour managed to get through, we all know potentially could be reversed in 3 years anyway.
Let me come to Brexit, but I'm going to do the cheeky analyst thing of just putting a caveat on my last answer, which
Okay.
is just watch out for Andy Burnham. So
Right.
that is one, I'm definitely leaning towards it, but I think the question mark that I have in my mind is just timing over
Mm,
Andy Burnham coming back. Because if you look at the polls, he is the one candidate who is popular with the country
hmm
and has the ability to consolidate that Labour vote. So let's just see what happens around, is there a route back for Andy Burnham into the House of Commons? How does that play out, and timelines? So anyway, not to hedge, but just to
Right.
introduce a caveat on that front. Now,
And for him to come back, obviously, we need somebody to step down from their seat for a by-election. So
I
is that
don't
the
think that
case?
would be the problem, because
Right.
I think someone in a Greater Manchester seat would step down.
hmm
I think the issue for him more is, do I resign as mayor of Greater Manchester?
Right.
Is that a better route, a faster route for me to get back? Is there time to then hold a by-election in time for
hmm
then me to be in, for then there to be a contest? There's those kind of variables to think through, or and the interaction with whether Labour's National Executive Committee give him permission to run. But let's see. But anyway, just to kind of introduce the sort of Burnham factor, as it were. But from Burnham to Brexit, so on the Brexit side, I do think this is an area that whoever is Labour leader is going to major on much more, namely um, deeper ties with the European Union. There are a number of reasons for that. The first is it has the potential to be quite a motivating issue with voters that you've lost to other parties on the left.
Mhm.
And two, with the public overall, I think actually Labour strategists will conclude they're quite fatigued with the debate from 2016, and they think that Brexit has delivered so far hasn't
Yes.
been all that great. So we've got some space to exploit here. The issue, though, will be what you hinted at, which is it's all very well to get rhetorical and say we want a Swiss style deal with the European Union. Takes two to tango, and you're negotiating with Brussels. And I suppose if you're on the Brussels side, are deeper relationships with the UK top of your in tray at the moment, given everything going on in the world? And two, why would we necessarily deal with you when there could be a reform government in a few years? But I'll just say two things in closing. One, I think the reform position could be a bit more pragmatic than what people realise, because they'll have seen the same polling as Labour, that if this becomes a kind of straight debate similar to what it was in 2016, that could damage them, given the kind of the way in which Brexit has been delivered mood amongst the public at the moment. So I think with them, they may be a bit clever in terms of, aspects of the deal so far on food and drink, veterinary, for instance. Maybe they say, oh, we won't actually, we're fine with that bit, but we're going to seek this bigger deal with Brussels. They're just a bit cleverer. And then, I suppose the last thing is, while I've said there is that political space there for Labour, the more you try and push, getting closer to the single market or whatever, the more Brussels replies and says, great, okay, but two things. One, freedom of movement. We've got to have that conversation again. And two, you've got to make direct payments into the EU budget. And those two issues could catch if not handled skillfully. So it's definitely going to be back. It's definitely going to be something that a new leader, new prime minister, or if Starmer's still in post, talks about more. But let's see the detail, and still some political risks.
I think the direct payments to the EU, I think, would obviously sit quite heavy with people after the vote. So just to summarize, markets will still be very much dominated by the US and Iranian conflict. However, we do have the local elections and national elections, obviously in Scotland and Wales coming up, where Labour potentially could suffer large losses. Expectations are leaning towards, a change of leadership or leadership challenge over the summer. However, whoever that leader is going to know they have to maintain fiscal credibility and stay within the rules as we go into the autumn budget season. So, with that, James, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your insights. Join us for the next episode of Market Pulse, where we're back with Venus. Look forward to having you again with us soon.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.